Hello, everyone, and welcome back to EdHeroes Voices podcast. I'm your host, Alina Baimen. We explore the lives and stories of people who are making an impact in the world. Our guest today is Philip Hsin. Philip was a Cambodian refugee in the U.S. to now CEO and author of The Passion Gap. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you, Alina. It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this podcast series.
Thank you. Let's jump into maybe your childhood and how you grew up. You were a Cambodian refugee, and then you immigrated to the U.S. with your family. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and some of the challenges, maybe?
Sure. So my family were originally Chinese ethnicity. Mom and dad ended up in Cambodia, got married there. Had 4 kids. I was third out of 4. And we basically were living a pretty middle-class lifestyle in Cambodia. And then, as you know, the war in Vietnam started. That kind of moved over to Cambodia. And in 1975, about 10 days before the fall of Phnom Penh, we were fortunate enough to get airlifted out of there by a military cargo plane. And, I was 9 years old. I have a younger sister and 2 older siblings. And the next thing we know, we're being, sort of shifted to different places. We ended up in Thailand. Dad decided to declare us refugees. We originally went to stay with a relative in Thailand. But I think Dad, being a very independent individual, decided to declare ourselves refugees. So we ended up being shifted from refugee camps to processing centers in the Philippines, to San Diego. And ultimately, we were sponsored by a Lutheran church in Portland, Oregon. So that's kind of where things started. Back in the 70s, it's interesting. We didn't have English as a second language. We were technically the first family from Cambodia to land in Portland, Oregon. We even made it into the newspaper. And
Wow.
but that experience was quite interesting because there really wasn't any formal English as a language programs. So we were just kind of thrown into school and had to learn everything sort of on the go.
What was your day-to-day like, overall when you were living in the U.S. in Portland, Oregon?
It was a kind of a strange experience because, you're going from a country where it's extremely warm and everything, and you get over there and, it's a cold place. Oregon up in the Pacific Northwest. I think the climate was part of it, part of the getting adjusted to. My parents, I think, probably had a tougher time. They were in their 40s and late 30s. And of course, not speaking the language, both having worked in Cambodia. Mom actually had her own business before she had to shut that down because of the war. I think it was very stressful for them as parents. I think for us, our experience really was, interesting, right? I mean, we started out going to school like everybody else, didn't understand a lot of stuff that was going on. But funny enough, our even though we didn't really spend a lot of time studying in Cambodia, I ended up in a advanced math class. That was good. It helped. But English-wise and everything else, terribly adjusted to the environment. I think friendship and developing friendship was also tough because we didn't speak the language. Otherwise, we started working at a pretty young age. We found that you could actually pick strawberries starting at the age of 12. So, I started picking strawberries in the summers. And then eventually ended up working part-time jobs like everybody else, busting tables, dishwashing, and things like that.
Oh, that's amazing. And was there anyone that you were looking up to during that time that kind of got you inspired and got you to do everything that you've done in your life?
It's funny when I think back about those days, right? My inspiration was my dad. And my dad started out being a janitor at Nabisco, the biscuit cookie company. And subsequently, they went back to school, same with my mother, to learn English and so forth, and became a lab technician there, testing cookies. I think he was making at the time about $10 an hour. And that really was my dream. It was like, hey, if I can make $10 an hour, I'd be happy. And then you kind of say, well, maybe every year above that, I can increase it by $1,000. So that was really my dream. I didn't expect that, after university, I would end up being given an opportunity to work at an investment bank. And then from there, kind of, life happens. And I was fortunate enough to end up working in Asia as well in the finance industry.
Can you tell us a little bit about the finance world? You got into it. How was it? How was the culture like? And why did you decide to go into finance?
So the story is when I was in university and I was working on one of these college work study jobs, I was actually declaring psychology as my major. And I happened to be working with two graduate social science students who were married. I think one was a geography master's and one was probably a sociology master's. And they kind of looked at me and said, Phil, if you really need money when you graduate, this is not the way to go. And so with that piece of advice, I changed my major to finance, decided to keep behavioral sciences as my major, as my minor, and graduated with a finance degree. Having said that, my first job out of school wasn't in finance because, I went to Oregon State University, which obviously is not known for finance and nobody really recruits out of there. But I was fortunate enough to have met somebody at an investment bank. She suggested that I go and do an interview in Southern California, which I did. And that was it. Somebody offered me a job. I remember walking into the office in the first day and somebody actually said, there's your office. I'm thinking, wow, I get an office at 20 something. Didn't expect it. And what did I see? What a change, right? You go from not having a lot to being around people who are obviously, graduates of top universities. Everybody had a Mercedes, everybody had a BMW. It was quite an eye-opening experience.
And what was the firm the first one that you were working in?
It's actually been absorbed into Bank of America now. It used to be called Securities. It was part of it.
Pretty much Bank of America straight away. You were also working with Goldman and some big names in the finance industry.
Yes, I was very fortunate. Once I got out to Asia, I think I came out here at the right time. It was just right before the sort of Asian boom, and I was given a lot of opportunities to progress. And with each progression, more opportunities opened up. And so names like Goldman Sachs, I worked with BGI, which was Barclays Global Investors before he was bought by BlackRock. So I've had some wonderful opportunities to work for large organizations.
That's amazing. I mean, you worked for such huge organizations, but then you founded two companies, one PFH Strategic Advisory that's housing one of your books now, and PHCL, which has to do with technology and education. So that's interesting. How did you transition from finance into founding those two completely different companies?
It was all accidental. To be honest, it started, I think, during COVID. When the lockdown happened, it was the first time in my life that I didn't have to travel like every other week. And it was the first time I sat down and actually understood what my kids were going through in school. I was able to help them with their English and science and so forth, but I didn't speak any Chinese, and I still don't speak Chinese. And so I couldn't really do much with the Chinese side of things. And I kind of left that to my former wife. Unfortunately, during that period, he was in primary 4. I learned that he was actually failing his Chinese. So I decided, that I have time. I might as well sit down with him and try to figure out how to help him. So I started writing, flashcards for every vocabulary he had to learn. And that evolved eventually into the app. And then the other reason that the app came about, again, was also accidental. As you may know, I think we spoke about this, that I'm an older parent. I'm 59 this year, and my children are still 14 and 12. And so I was inspired at the time by a book I read by Gino Kelly. And he was basically diagnosed with inoperable brain cancer. And he wanted to leave something for his daughter, who was still a young teenager at the time. And I thought, wow, what an inspiration. And I kind of wanted to do the same because, when my kids get older and when they become parents themselves, they may have questions. And I might not be around or I might not be able to help given the advanced age. So I decided, let's put it all into a book. And as I was writing the book, it got more and more interesting. It started with just philosophical questions. And then I got it into the job section and started writing about jobs. And it landed on me that, kids going forward probably are not going to be able to rely on a traditional job for their income. They're going to have to basically learn how to invest money. They're going to have to learn how to run their own businesses, and so forth. And when I stumbled on that chapter, I realized that I didn't know what it was like to run a business. So how could I advise my children on how to think about that? And so I decided, let's kick off a company. And since I've been doing work with my son already, let's take that and turn it into an app. And at the same time, that's how things got started. It was completely accidental.
Wow, amazing. I mean, you're an amazing dad, doing all those flashcards for kids. writing a book, developing apps just to help your kids. That's really, really impressive. And you also talked about, having those talks with your kids about their paths in life, about their perspective on kind of passion versus money, on what they should pursue. You're giving some great advice. What did you tell them about how to make those choices?
It's funny because kids, as they are, my son included, a few years back, he started picking up basketball and decided that, maybe this is kind of something I'd like to consider doing. So he asked me one day, what do you think about me playing in the NBA? Now, we all know as parents that probabilities are pretty low, but at the same time, you don't necessarily want to take away dreams and aspirations. So it really had me thinking hard about, what can I do to help my children think about this? And I reflect back on a moment in my life. I remember in 2001 or so, I ended up in Singapore in a new job, thinking I'm going to love this company, I'm going to love the people I work with, and therefore my job's going to be really exciting. And then I realized after the first 3 or 4 months, I was just bored to death. And then I thought to myself, what's going on here, right? I mean, I'm in finance, I'm getting paid well. And I realized, this passion for psychology that I had when I was back in university was kind of coming back. And I was asking myself, should I be doing something in this area that I'm passionate about? And so I started digging into that a little bit deeper. And I thought, what, can I apply my passion in psychology to my job? And so I started researching products that really were focusing on individual investors who were having difficulty making investment decisions. And sure enough, we had a wonderful study that looked at the interest level, the knowledge level, and the time that people are willing to commit to invest. And what they found was that a majority of people lacked the interest. And so I thought, wow, this is interesting. So as I dug more and more into it, I realized that, there was a product that the company launched, and I did the same thing. I took that same product, we customized it for the Singapore market, and we actually made it work. And from that moment on, I realized, wait a minute, I've been thinking about passion all wrong. If we could think about what it is that we enjoy about that particular passion, not just as a role like a psychologist, because I love psychology, but maybe as solving complex people problems, society problems. And that's what I was really doing, right? I was applying it to a finance industry, but I was applying psychology rules to people. So I started adopting the same concept and trying to see if I could work that out with my son. And we started looking at traits that he enjoyed about basketball, the competition, the teamwork, the constant improvement. And we then teased that out as his passion rather than basketball. And then we started looking at, why not basketball? Well, did he have the aptitude for it? Probably not, right? He's a 5'10" at best. My ex was maybe 5'1". So he's not going to be a giant. And if he were, he'd have to be very committed. He'd have to be driven. He'd have to be talented. So I started realizing, let's take some of that and let's apply it to what he is good at. What are his aptitudes? How good is he at it? And then trying to combine that to find areas that work for him, similar to the things that I did with myself when I applied psychology to finance. And that seems to be working out quite well. I mean, we're starting to figure out, which classes should be taking gearing towards this area that involves, in a way, he's also very interested in people, in psychology. He's also quite good at science and math. And so we're kind of playing around with some ideas right now to how to combine them into sort of this passion and employment that makes sense for him, that optimizes his skill set.
And what did he come to? Or actually, he's quite young for.
He is still very young. I mean, we just got done doing his class selections for his secondary degree classes. And we can see now that, science and math, he's still relatively interested in, has done well in. And I think, this sensitivity that he has, all his teachers say the same thing. This kid is adaptable. He loves to help people. He's very sensitive to things. So we're still trying to shape that into something that really fits him as an individual. And then trying to explain to him that, you're now developing skill sets to ultimately generate income for yourself and your family if you choose to have one at some stage.
Wow. So he's 14 right now, correct?
He's 14 right now, yes.
He's 14 and he already understands finance, money. He's thinking ahead about, his passions and what he can do, and he can break it down into what he'd be good at. Incredible. That's quite insane, actually. Impressive.
I don't know. I mean, I kind of joke around with my friends that my kids are my social experiments. So a lot of this stuff is just, things that I think about and I've just sort of come up with. I mean, I can't say that there's any science behind it. I haven't really studied it and I haven't found research to back it up. I just know that from a practical perspective, having gone through what I went through myself, I want to make it as easy for him as possible. It doesn't mean that I don't want him to thrive. I just don't want him to go through all the steps that I had to go through to learn the things I learned. And so I'm trying to find out ways to help him sort of get there a little quicker.
That's amazing. And so the passion gap, your book, it explores kind of those concepts that you're just talking about. What else does it encompass, and how would a person go about, what would a person take away from the book?
I think for me, what inspired me to write that book was really a piece of advice that I received from this general practitioner that I met in Singapore. I can't even figure out who he is because I've lost the emails. That was 20 plus years ago. Like I said, I barely knew him. But at the time, I wrote to him with a decision that I had to make about my career. Should I stay in Hong Kong, stay in this high-powered role? Should I come to Singapore, work with people I thought I shared values with? Should I go back to school and get that psychology degree that I've always been passionate about? And what he ended up telling me was quite, I think, quite thoughtful. He said to me, Phil, I think you're looking for happiness in all the wrong places. You seem to be focusing purely on a job. And he said that for him, he believes that most people will find their source of happiness from either serving God, serving society, or serving family. And he said, if you think about it, Phil, and spend some time thinking about which one of those sources is your main one, then you realize that a job is nothing more than a means to reach there or to achieve that source of happiness. And so when he told me that, I was so inspired by it. It just kind of sat in the back of my mind. And when I had my children, I realized, oh my God, he was absolutely right? There's nothing more motivating than, having this child in front of you, and I have two now, and that's what drives me. And so the passion gap kind of drives into that sort of source. Where does it come from? And then once you know where it comes from, well, what other things come out of it? I wrote a chapter after that on, well, how much money is enough? Because now that you know who you're doing it for, well, what kind of lifestyle do I want to provide for my children and myself? So we then went on and said, well, great. Now that I know how much income I need, wait, what about the job? How do I make sure that I'm able to earn the money and sustain the money? That then led me to this other concept, which a lot of people, have written about, which is this idea of financial independence mindset, right? Being able to generate income, not just from a traditional job, but from investing and from running your own business and so forth. And so I got into that, and ultimately what I try to do then is say, well, these practical money questions that we've answered. We know the questions about what brings us happiness. How do we put it all together now? How do we put it together so that, it all leads to some meaning and purpose in life? And so that's kind of what the whole passion gap is about. It's sort of figuring out how to figure out all these things about life that matters and then bring it all together into a big picture. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's sort of what the book.
That makes sense. I think it's really hard to put into words a big concept like that. It's something that people struggle with, and not just when they're, in school deciding what they're doing, but I think it's something that follows you throughout. It's something that I think about maybe at least several times a year. It used to be several times a month, a week, even every day when I was graduating university. And still now, I really love that idea of following and serving God, your family, or the society. That's quite beautiful. I think it does often come to that, because a lot of the decisions that we make, even though sometimes they may seem selfish, they're just in service of our passions, of something that we're really, really passionate about.
Absolutely. And I think the problem we see today is that when you get advice, I tend to find two things. The first is that the answers tend to be binary, right? If somebody asks you, should I follow passion or should I follow money? the answer is always going to be like, Mark Cuban would tell you, follow money. Because at the end of the day, if you're not very good at what you're passionate about, you're not going to really make money out of it. Steve Jobs would tell you the opposite, right? Always follow passion, because if you do that, you'll enjoy what you do. You'll be the best at what you're doing, and the money will come. And what I find is that in real life, there's a sort of a degree of percentages between the two, depending on who you are. And so, you come from a wealthy family or a trust fund kid, well, money's not an issue. So you should always follow passion. On the other hand, for most of us mere mortals, we have to consider both sides of the equation. So that's the first thought that comes to mind, is that it's binary. And then the second thing that comes to mind is that, when you hear advice, it tends to come from the perspective of the advice giver, right? So for instance, Mark Cuban will tell you, hey, I went through this experience. I was not very talented at basketball, and I went through the route of, running a business and everything else that worked for him. But when we think about advice, and when I think about advice to my kids, I try to put it into the perspective of where they're coming from. So let's look at it from the advice seeker's perspective. And I think if we can do that, avoid being binary about our suggestions or advice, and then take the position of rather than the advice giver, I think that's sort of the ideal approach to it all.
So who should really be reading your book and getting that advice?
So I target the direct target market, I believe, for the book really should be anyone from the age of, let's say, 17, 18 to maybe your early 30s, when you're still thinking about these bigger questions about life. I think the other group, and since we're on, talking about education, I think, teachers, mentors, parents, I think would also be a natural audience for the book. And maybe we can talk a bit more about teaching, because when I was thinking through, like, how should I help my son and daughter think about income generation, I had to ask myself, is our educational system today helping them to think about making money? Or could it actually hamper us from actually being able to think about making money outside of a traditional job, right? Because most schools prepare you to go and work for a company. And so if that's the mindset we're teaching our kids, and as we know, the world is changing, right? The number of companies outsourcing roles, either overseas or through contracts, means that our kids, or my kids, and perhaps other young people, are going to face an environment where the traditional employer-employee relationship may actually not be available. So then we have to start thinking about making money outside of that job, right? What are some of the challenges for people who wants to start an investment portfolio? Or I want to start a business. What's stopping me from starting a business? So those are the kind of things that I think about, and I try to model out so that I can actually explain to my kids and kind of walk them through the process and say, hey, guys, try to think about earning money from an investment portfolio. So we started a portfolio a little bit after COVID for them to actually see what it's like to have an investment portfolio and to follow it all the time, and just to understand how markets go up, go down, what a stock is, what a bond is. And then on the business end, I try to involve them as much as I can in the activities that I get involved with the app and so forth.
Well, I really need some of that advice from you as well. I guess I have to get reading in the book just to understand. You said that you're mostly serving your family, but you just mentioned the app as well. That seems like it's not only serving your family, but a lot of society. Could you tell us a little bit about the app and what made you make it?
Sure. So one of the things that I found when my son was struggling with learning Chinese, I realized that it's actually a major issue for a lot of other kids that are in a similar situation as himself. So a little bit of background about the Singapore educational system. If you are of Chinese ethnicity in Singapore, you are required to pick Chinese as your mother tongue in school. As you know, Singapore is a English-speaking language from a business and official perspective. So every day our kids speak English, but they're required to pass a test in written and spoken Chinese. That became a real challenge for my son. And, as a parent, you realize that, when your kids are suffering and you start seeing tears in their eyes and they're trying to remember, I think by the time they reach primary 6, they have to memorize 1,800 characters. And that's a lot, right? And by secondary 4, something like 2,500 characters. And you realize that, without that frequency of use, without speaking it all the time, without speaking it at home, how is a kid who's English speaking going to be able to adapt to something like that? And so I was thinking that, there's got to be some things I can do using psychology as a way to help. And so I started building in, little tools like, for instance, not a lot of people think about this, I don't believe, but how do you complexity rate Chinese characters? Are there things that make a character harder to remember? For instance, a larger number of strokes. For instance, if the word is not frequently used or more frequently used. For instance, if you have to learn how to read versus how to write the character. And so I would go in and play with ideas like that and then create an app that allows you to actually get exposure to the more complex characters without having to put in more work. Because we know these kids are hurting to try to learn the basics. So I'm not going to, ask for more. And so, so that was part of it. And then, when I thought broader about it, and I said, well, what am I trying to do with this app? I said, well, there are other parents out there with kids who have the same problem. And so my partner and I decided that, let's just keep it as a sort of a social enterprise project. Let's not think about the profitability at this time. Let's try to cover our costs and let's try to see if we can help other kids and parents that are in the same position as ourselves.
Wow, that's really, really impressive. Do you think that learning other languages like bilingualism, or some people even more, helps in other areas of life?
Absolutely. I mean, look, in my personal experience, because I don't speak Chinese, my potential in my role is somewhat limited, right? I've always been sort of categorized as being a person who covers Southeast Asia, because North Asia, you got to speak either Korean or Japanese or Chinese. And so that certainly has limitations. What's interesting though, is I've been thinking a lot about this question because, my son is forced to take Chinese and I'm often asking myself, should he even be taking it? Then I realized, what? With technology and AI, translation is going to be a given. I mean, there's no need to actually learn how to read and write Chinese because AI and technology is going to do a lot of that for you. But translation doesn't allow you to build relationships. And that's where I think the spoken language, the ability to understand, makes a difference. Because for me, relationship comes down to understanding cultural aspects, right? Because everybody views the world through their own cultural lenses. And in order for you to understand that, you've got to have the language to go with it. And so I think it's still going to be necessary in terms of language learning, in terms of trying to understand how people are thinking, how to build that strong relationship beyond just saying, well, here's what I want to tell you. So that's my opinion. Again, let me just take a step back and tell you that I am not a teacher. I am not trained psychologist or anything or a linguist. So these are just personal feelings from a father.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. You say to learning one another's culture to really understand what the other person's feeling, to have those inside jokes, to understand the little cultural intricacies, is to, I guess, personally build relationship, but that also would help with business and long-term in life.
Absolutely right. I mean, we can't get away from that, right? And we have some time, I'd love to maybe give you some thoughts also about this idea of culture, language, and values.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? Because a lot of times I find that we conflate the idea of culture and values, and so what I've been doing a lot of thinking about too is that, when I think about getting along with people and building relationships, when I first met you, you're from Kazakhstan, I'm from Singapore, the US. But at the end of the day, no matter what our cultures are and how different they are, I think we share the same value systems. And I think most people do, right? We love our families. We want to take care of our families. We believe in working hard. We believe in society and contributing. So I think if we could focus more on the shared values, I think it's going to be much easier to connect with people. And so for me, every time I think about relationships, I go to a lot of different countries and I meet a lot of different people from various backgrounds. I never fail to find a connection if I go down to the money. And I think when you and I started talking, that's what we did. Or we talked about, your background, your family, and, what kind of environment you were raised in and what kind of got you started in doing education. So I think, just some thoughts there.
Yeah, we were talking with a friend the other day as well, and we were talking about how it's really easy to bond with people over if you just show kindness and empathy, because overall, that's what it boils down to. You can be in the wrong, You can be alienated, anything like that, if you just approach almost every situation with kindness and empathy. You hear the other person out, just speak from the heart. I guess that's so what you're talking about the core values of a human being rather than the cultural or language differences.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, as an American, it's really weird, right? Well, a former American, I'm not Singaporean, but as an American, you look at how divided America is today, and it's scary, right? Because I would guess, and if I go back to America today and I visit with my family and friends, I don't see the values being that different. We all care about family, we all care about society, we all want the best things for our nation. So if we focus less on the differences and more on that common shared value system, I think, we'd be a lot better off.
I think that would be a really good speech to give in like a Republican Democrat rally.
Sorry, I know we're moving away from education, so let me stop there.
No worries. I think that is a very interesting topic, actually. Do you have any thoughts on that and the political situation right now in the US?
Again, I just think that, when I look back to the 70s when I was growing up, what I can appreciate back then was that even though we were different, let's say you're Asian, I don't think we had the kind of identity that kind of goes along with everything today. It's like, you're not only Asian American, you're Chinese American, you're Korean American, you're, Caribbean American. And I just find it a little bit strange, because being out of the US, I haven't sort of didn't live through all those changes in the last 30 years or so, however long I've been in Asia. And a great story to tell, right? I was in a meeting in New York with a colleague who was from Australia, another colleague who was from America, and myself and my Singaporean colleague walked into the meeting. And as we walked in, our American colleague said, "Hey, there's our Asian colleagues from Singapore." And our Australian colleague looked at her and kind of said, "Gosh, that's kind of racist." And the American colleague just couldn't get it. She's like going, "I don't get this, right? I mean, they're Asian Americans or Asian Singaporeans." And then it had me thinking, when you're in Australia, nobody says I'm Australian Chinese. You're just Australian. And I think about what it said, "Hey, I'm Australian Chinese." People might actually take a view on this and say, "Well, are you trying to say something here? Are you racist or something?" Right? And so I kind of think that, for me, I go back to that statement. Let's focus on the commonalities and values, and let's not worry so much about the race, the ethnicity, the other stuff that are cultural or non-values based. But that's my thought. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not a political scientist. I don't know much of a political system, but that's just my thoughts.
That's very interesting that you say that because there's a lot of kind of ongoing debate on what to focus on. Are we trying to, on the one hand, it's trying to build a society that's unified and everyone is, equal in an ideal world in terms of equity, in terms of values and kindness that we express towards each other. But on the other hand, there is this entire history with a lot of baggage is one way to put it, and a lot of inequality and oppression in um, different genders and different races, and sometimes putting that is to kind of acknowledge something that they've gone through. I think depending on the part of the world, depending on the background, it varies a lot, and it's a very interesting topic of discussion as well.
Well, it reminds me of something that happened when we first got to America for us. The first thing my dad said to us after we got to America was, "We're now in a different country, assimilate." And for a while, it felt weird because I was asking myself, am I giving up my culture? Am I giving up being Asian? But over the years, as I think back about it, Dad was absolutely right, right? The values at the time when I was there, I mean, when I first got there, it was all about working hard. It was about, when you're given opportunities, you don't just exploit it. You don't want to exploit it. You actually want to work at it and earn it. And I think those, again, are values that are common to everybody. And so my advice to my kids is, wherever you go, you've got to assimilate. But that doesn't mean you're giving up who you are. You can still be, culturally Asian or Chinese or whatever. But hard work, fitting into society, contributing back to society, treating everyone equally, as you said, and all that, that's something we should actually embrace more. And I think that if we did that, I think we'd see a lot less differences. And again, this is kind of weird. I'm going to go a little bit on a tangent here. You mentioned empathy. And for me, what I kind of gut feel kind of tells me this. If we keep separating ourselves and we keep making ourselves feel different from each other, I believe our level of empathy for one another will naturally go down, right? The more similar we feel for one another, the more empathy we're going to feel for one another. So I think this is something that we have to be very careful about, right? We want to make sure that, everyone is recognized for who they are and what they bring to the table. But at the same time, I think what we need to be careful about is not to separate ourselves to the point where we all feel like we have to serve our own interests.
Yeah.
And that's going to reduce empathy for one another. And that's not how you build societies, right? And to me, I try to tell my kids to always be empathetic and try to put yourself in the other person's position and see how that feels. And I think it's got to be both ways as well.
Yeah, makes sense. That's really beautiful. I really like us to sit that. I want that to sit with me for a second. I do agree that empathy is built on something shared. And the more we differentiate, the more we build borders, the less we understand that the other person is just human, just like us. And we're kind of very similar and almost the same in many ways. And you're absolutely right. Looking at the similarities, looking at other people as human is learning to build empathy. And it just feels like in the world nowadays, the more kind of capitalistic, individualistic it becomes, the more we isolate ourselves, the less we talk to each other, ask for favors, make plans, the more we lose empathy for each other and for ourselves as well.
Absolutely. And I think the other issue too is that, when you start feeling disjointed and not part of a community, there's a lot of sense of like loneliness and a lot of sense of, not having anybody there to support you. And the one thing that we thought about, or I thought about when I was writing the book was, in America, you think about how it was formed. I mean, aside from the Native Americans, everybody else there are immigrants. And the one thing about immigrants is that we kind of cut our ties with our families that we left behind, right? So we then, as a culture, as Americans, were quite independent. And then if you look at the geography of America, everybody's living in different places. I mean, take myself, for instance, right? When I graduated, I moved to California to work. My brother was in Texas. I think my other sister was also in Texas, but she's now in Tennessee. My other sister's in Hong Kong. So you kind of lose that sort of familial support that I think, I certainly don't want that for my children. So I'm insisting that they stay together physically if possible. So that's another thought that came to mind when we were writing that book about, sort of that whole financial independence mindset. Why is this so necessary? It's because in America, as I've observed it, there is very little support that we can provide one another because physically we're so far apart and we don't have that connection with family as a heritage. You contrast that to Singapore, they're
So close together.
45 minutes, from one end to the other end of the island. And then, the grandparents are always around when the kids need some support, aunts, uncles, the cousins, hopefully lifelong friends from school because they go to the same school all their formative years. So those are the things that I find really interesting. And I find that, it's such a contrast to see it from both sides. And it goes back to really just understanding that, we can form that connection with family, with friends. I think it's going to help a lot of us deal with sort of uncertainties in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Helps us deal with uncertainties and possibly even with mental health. But I think that's a different question.
That's a whole different area. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I completely agree with you. I mean, it's really tough being alone. And, I'm one of those people that probably like yourself, right? You've never lived at home and, you've always lived in other places and never been around family. And yeah, you build a certain sense of resilience. But, if I could, I'd love to be able to be closer to my family and friends and be able to just hang out when I need to and, be able to just drop by and say hi and so forth.
As we're coming to an end of today's session, I was wondering if you had any kind of advice to young people struggling to decide on their future.
I know I'm going to beat the horse to death on this one, but stay away from binary advice. I understand that for every decision, there is a spectrum of answers that you need to think hard about and say, well, which one of these applies to me? And to do that, you really have to sit down and get to know yourself. It's tough. I mean, being a young person today is tough because, when I was growing up, if you studied accountancy in school, you're going to be an accountant. Today it's very difficult. You can study accountancy and do something else completely different, or study art history and go into investing. So, the whole paradox of having choices is hard to deal with. I think the other thing, and I'd love to say this to parents as well, is, and I've had this fortunate situation where I can spend more time with my kids. I really think we need to spend more time with our kids. It's tough. I know it's tough, right? Everybody's working all the time and everybody's stressed from work. But if we really love our kids that much, I think we need to take time to sit down with them, spend time with them, understand who they are, what drives them, and stop labeling them. I mean, I hear the term strawberry generation and I get upset because I'm thinking to myself, these kids, should they necessarily put themselves in that position completely, right? I mean, we had our kids in a developed country where they don't need to worry about the basics, the sort of survivability factors of growing up. So how do we expect them to all of a sudden turn around and say, hey, I'm done with school now. I'm going to go out there and forge my own life and, learn how to and survive on my own. So I think we have to, as parents, I know I sound like maybe a little bit of a overprotecting parent, but to me, I try to look at it from their perspective and kind of say, yeah, let's take it easy on them and spend more time and get to know them better. And let's figure out exactly what they're good at, what they're not good at, what they love to do, what they don't love to do. And let's customize it for them. Let's help them figure out who they are. And I encourage the kids to do the same. I spend time doing that.
Philip, thank you so much for sharing. I think this interview has been an absolute pleasure, and it was incredible hearing about your journey, about your insights, about the work that you're doing, about your role as a parent as well. I think is very, very helpful to a lot of the listeners. Thank you for sharing your story today.
Not at all, Alina. Thank you again for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And have a wonderful trip. I know you're going off, so.
Thank you. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on the EdHeroes Voices podcast today. And don't miss getting your hands on Philip's new book, The Passion Gap. Until next time, and keep learning.
Carolina. Bye-bye.